Historical Society of Michigan. This is Michael Caskey, one of our board members and one of our key docents. We do tours, programs, lectures, all connected to Michigan's Jewish history and celebrating the history of our state's Jewish communities, organizations, and institutions. And since this is a somewhat familiar crowd, I'm not going to go through all the things that we do, but I do want to promote one event, a couple events, but Wednesday, June 22nd, we're hosting Nash Gen at the Belle Isle Aquarium. Nash Gen is a new series we developed that is an hour of social and nashing and some beverages, and then about an hour of program. And this program will be walking tours of Belle Isle led by Jennifer Boardman, who really was instrumental in reopening and establishing the Friends of the Belle Isle Conservatory. And besides the well-known Jewish connections, which is that the Belle Isle Aquarium was designed by Albert Kahn and brought to the state by David Heinemann, there's many, many, many other Jewish connections to the aquarium. There are no Jewish fish that I'm aware of. So with that, I will let Mike take it away, and then I'll jump in about halfway.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
First thing I want to mention is that this entire program is possible through a very generous donation from the David Horducker Grant Fund Trust, and we're very grateful to the trust for giving us some money to put on this program. Now, I also want to tell you that what we're doing today in 45 minutes or so is a short introduction. This is Detroit Jewish History 0101. We do offer higher level programs, more comprehensive programs, and if you are interested in any of those, you should check the Jewish Historical Society website. Our visit today to Detroit of yesterday begins with a look back at how the Jewish community first came to the area, why they came, and where they settled. As we travel through time and space, I hope to be able to share with you many of the opportunities and accomplishments of these early Jewish settlers. The next 45 minutes or so is a brief overview of the many, many tremendous accomplishments of the Jews of Detroit. So sit back and come along with me. Detroit was founded as Fort Pontchartrain by the French in 1701. The site was protected by the Detroit River on the south and the Savoyard River on the west and north. Local North American tribes were encouraged to camp near the fort. In order to facilitate the fur trade. Beaver fur was enormously popular in Europe. French King Louis XIV's love for beaver caps and neck warmers established this fashionable must-have. The abundance of fur around Detroit and Michigan attracted many fur traders willing to take long and dangerous canoe trips for the opportunity to get rich in the lucrative fur trade. During the French period of Detroit history, neither Protestants nor Jews could legally own property or even set foot on New France soil. In other parts of the continent, however, many of the North American, Dutch, and English colonies accepted Jewish settlers. In 1654, 23 Jews fled the Portuguese Inquisition in Brazil and were permitted to settle in what was then New Amsterdam, now of course New York. They were allowed to settle provided they not be a burden to the community and must be able to take care of themselves. This small community of Jewish settlers founded a congregation, She'ereth Israel, the remnant of Israel. Today this congregation, which is still Sephardic, is located on West 70th Street. Within 2 decades, by 1780, an estimated 2,500 Jews had followed, settling primarily on the Atlantic coast. After Great Britain captured French Canada in 1760, some Jewish traders settled in Montreal, and some canoed westward. We know of 5 Jews who came to Michigan during the period of British rule from 1760 to 1796. Ezekiel Solomon was born in Berlin in 1735 and is believed to be Michigan's first Jewish resident. After serving with the British Army, he came to Fort Michilimackinac, the location of this historic marker, in 1761 to trade for furs. By 1784, he was one of 8 merchants regulating trade around the fort. Among his partners were his cousin Levi Solomon, Gershon Levy, Chapman Abraham, and Benjamin Lyon. Ezekiel was also a member of Canada's first synagogue, Montreal's Congregation Sharis Israel, which was founded in 1768. This marker, located on the Detroit riverfront in Milliken State Park, honors Chapman Abraham, who was considered Detroit's first Jewish resident. A German-born Jewish fur trader, we know that he arrived in Montreal sometime around 1759 and began trading with the natives. Sometime in 1862, Abraham set up a trading post in the British-controlled Fort Detroit and was there in 1763 when Chief Pontiac attacked and put the fort under siege. There's a legend about Chapman Abraham that ties into this attack. In 1763, he was captured by the Native Americans, tied to a stake, and was about to be burned alive when he asked for something to drink. The legend that is told is that the Indians gave him a hot drink, so hot in fact it burned his tongue. Angry and in pain, he spit it out, screaming at the top of his lungs and kind of acting crazy. Thinking he was possessed, the Indians released him. In 1781, Abraham purchased a house on St. Louis Street in Fort Pontchartrain, which, if existed today, would be roughly near Hart Plaza. He also maintained a residence in Montreal, timing his annual trips back there to sell his acquired furs to coincide with the Jewish high holidays. Every year he canoed 75 days each way to and from Montreal, where he belonged to Sharis Israel. The opening of the Erie Canal, which ran from Albany to Buffalo in 1825, together with the introduction of Lake Erie steamships, made Michigan accessible. Farmland at $1.25 an acre attracted land-hungry New Englanders and later German immigrants. In the 1830s, many German immigrants began coming to America, fleeing poverty and oppressive governments. I should mention here, there was no Germany in 1830. There were states where the people spoke German. Germany was not united until 1870. Many more came after the failed revolutions of 1830 and 1848. These were largely well-educated immigrants who easily found employment or business opportunities. By 1850, when Detroit's population numbered approximately 21,000, there were between 50 and 60 Jews who called the community home. At first, they lived in hastily constructed clapboard houses just a few blocks east of Woodward Avenue in an area called Black Bottom. The name Black Bottom has nothing to do with the fact that African Americans later settled there. I talked earlier about the Savoyard River. It flooded every year, and that flooding enriched the soil. So it was called Black Bottom because the soil was so rich. What you are seeing here is the home of Isaac and Sarah Cousins, who opened their home to the small Jewish community for high holidays services 1850. 12 of these families formed the Beth El Society, or as we call it today, Temple Beth El, which means House of God. Michigan's first Jewish congregation was then an Orthodox service. The Jewish Historical Society of Michigan helps maintain around a dozen Michigan historical markers around the state. This one commemorates that first service and congregation and is located downtown, right near here, on the grounds of the Blue Cross Blue Shield building. This is a picture of Sarah Cousins, who was considered the founding member of Jewish Detroit. Not only did she open her home to embrace these religious gatherings, she was also instrumental in congregational activities, such as establishing a Jewish cemetery. Sarah ran a Hebrew, German, English day school and organized a society to visit and care for the sick. Opening her home was noble for sure, but there may have been other forces at work. It is believed Sarah encouraged her husband Isaac to invite the men to daven in their home so that she could look over eligible bachelors. She and Isaac were the parents of 5 daughters, Rebecca, Hannah, Caroline, Rosa, and Sally. Of course, one of the first things a congregation must do is purchase land for a cemetery. The Bethel Society did just that in 1850. Elmwood Cemetery holds the distinction of being the oldest continuously operating non-denominational cemetery in Michigan and was founded in 1846. Temple Bethel's section is small, just a half of 1 acre, but is obviously important for our community. All the plots have been sold. The last Jewish burial was in 2011. It was the first Jewish burial there in close to 30 years. One of the founders of Bethel Society, who is buried at the Elmwood Cemetery, is Edward Cantor. He first came to Detroit in 1844 at the age of 20 from Breslau, a formerly Polish city recently then annexed by Prussia. He soon left Detroit for Mackinac, where he learned the valuable skill of being able to converse with Native North American leaders in their native languages. Cantor returned to Detroit in 1852, was elected to the state legislature as a Democrat in 1857 after a campaign filled with anti-Semitic attacks on him. Cantor was twice a candidate for state treasurer and an activist in the Democratic Party. In 1872, he founded the German-American Band. This is not a picture of Samuel Marcus, by the way, I recently learned. But Samuel Marcus, the first rabbi of Bethel, wore many hats. Besides rabbi, he served as a boil and a sheikha, and he earned for all of this $200 a year. Unfortunately, he served for only 40 years, dying in the cholera epidemic in 1854, and is buried in Temple Bethel Cemetery. In 1861, Congregation Bethel purchased a former French Methodist Episcopal Church building on Brevard Street, slightly north of Champlain, which is now named East Lafayette. It also elected to align with the Reform movement, reflecting the growing Americanization of Jews living in this country. 17 of Bethel's more traditional congregants chose to leave Bethel and formed their own house of worship. In 1861, they founded the Sherry Tzedek Society, an Orthodox congregation, and in 1862, go back, Wendy, in 1862, purchased the former St. Matthew's Episcopal Church building on the southeast corner of East Congress and St. Antoine. This is a drawing of it. St. Matthew's was a black congregation, making this the first sale of a religious building between Detroit's black Christians and Jews. As these Detroit Jewish pioneers were creating a homeland, the country was conflicted over the issue of slavery. Detroit's role, as we all know, was critical during this period in our history. The Detroit River was the last stop on the Underground Railroad. This statue, located on the Detroit side of the Detroit River at the base of Hart Plaza, honors the contributions of Detroiters who helped slaves in their journey to freedom. It is entitled The Gateway to Freedom. And Windsor, on the other side of the river, is a companion statue, the Tower of Freedom. Interestingly, many former slaves remained in the Windsor area and started farming, mostly in Leamington. The Jewish community largely opposed slavery, and some were quite vocal in their opposition. There's a long roster of those who nobly aided escaping slaves during this period. Rabbi Liebman Adler, the rabbi at Congregation Bethel from 1854 to 61, became known as the abolitionist preacher because of his frequent anti-slavery sermons. Emil and Fanny Heinemann gave the fugitives new clothes so they could look like freedmen to people walking the streets. Edward Cantor, the banker, helped hide slaves, as did Mark Sloman, an auxiliary policeman. Sloman hid slaves in his home, and then in his own police uniform, escorted them to the Detroit River, where they would cross in the darkness of the night. Among those founding members of Congregation Bethel were two brothers, Samuel Heinemann and his brother Emil, who had come to the city and found great success in their wholesale clothing business. This is the 1874 home of Samuel Heinemann on Woodward Avenue. His brother, Emil Heinemann, and his wife Fanny lived in this beautiful 1859 home on the northeast corner of Woodward and Adelaide. The Civil War began in 1861 and lasted 4 years. The contributions of Michigan's Jewish families to the Civil War is remarkable. In 1861, at the start of this brutal war, there were 151 Jewish families in Michigan. From those 151 Jewish families, 181 men and boys would volunteer to serve in the Union Army. 38 never came home. We are now going to jump ahead to the late 1800s, a time in history when the population of Jewish Detroit was about to explode.
In the late 19th century, the city of Detroit was just beginning to emerge as the manufacturing mecca it would one day become. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, anti-Jewish riots in Russia and religious restrictions in Eastern Europe prompted a flood of Jewish immigration to the United States, where revolutionary processes were hitting factory floors, and Detroit in particular could mass produce anything from stoves to steamships to cigars. But for the Jewish immigrants of Eastern Europe, Detroit was more than industrial opportunity.
All right, for some reason the screen is working on this. There's always some kind of an issue, isn't there?
It's the voice of Paul Gross, isn't it?
Yeah.
The IT, you need your IT support.
You know why? These are the
19th century, the city of Detroit was just beginning to emerge as the manufacturing mecca it would one day become. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, anti-Jewish riots in Russia and religious restrictions in Eastern Europe prompted a flood of Jewish immigration to the United States, where revolutionary processes were hitting factory floors, and Detroit in particular could mass produce anything from stoves to steamships to cigars. But for the Jewish immigrants of Eastern Europe, Detroit was more than industrial opportunity. It was the chance to educate their children, to worship freely, and to build a new life, a life on Hastings Street. In 1880, Detroit's population had already reached 116,000, but fewer than 1,000 of those were Jews. They lived